Okay, we don't have anybody else, so if y'all want to come up here to the, I don't know what this is, we call it council's table. It might be easier, that way I don't have to repeat the question.
Comfy chairs.
I know, I think we probably gave you the ones that didn't squeak, but I don't know. Okay, I've promptly forgotten all of your names again, so I apologize for that, but if we could start again.
Shannon Chapel.
Okay,
Peggy Wainscott.
I remembered your last name.
Jenna Hunt.
All right. Now, Ms. Wainscott was here yesterday. I don't know. So I just want to give you a heads up that we are recording this, and it will be posted to our website. In fact, yesterday's meeting, I think, has already been posted there if anybody wants to engage in that torture. Yesterday, the way that we conducted it is we went through every single regulation and basically every change that we did. But since you all are all with Owen Electric and you seem to have specific concerns, would it be okay if we did not go over our I guess is our procedural rule, which is 807 KR 5001? Do you wish to discuss that? Okay, good. Well, how about our general rules or things, the 5006? I don't know if there was anything in there that pertained. There might be. There are some reporting requirements in there if you have any questions.
There wasn't very much in there, so.
No, I think that there wasn't a question regarding, we changed, was it burn and shock to injury in the reports? Yeah. And require that. We had some discussion with the gentleman from Clark Energy on that matter, and of course we invited comments. Do you have any follow-up on that, Ms. Wainscott?
No, I totally agree with him. I
Okay.
think you guys will be flooded with paperwork if we don't.
Well, and I understand, I got an inquiry from a party that wondered why we made the change, and we made the change a long time ago, to the best of my knowledge, when we were reviewing it. Apparently, the Kentucky version of OSHA has proposed a similar change, completely uncoordinated with us. We started our review in 2018, and this is probably the second review that we sought after, but good points been brought up. So,
Yeah, I think if it's just, I put here, maybe for technical jobs, relating
right.
to that.
You get stung by a bee in the
industry.
course of stringing up line, I don't know, and you have anaphylactic shock, and I don't think that is something that we
Exactly.
necessarily need to know. All right, so we can always circle back if you have anything else for 5006.
And the contractor, just the third-party contractor, that was the only place I primarily made notes.
Right, and then
for us to take.
whether or not to have that on file, who has to have who maintain the certification.
Right. I mean, we maintain all certifications and so forth on our direct contractors, but
Right.
third party, so.
Understood. Things that we can discuss. And
Okay.
we, once again, really invite comments on this because we've reviewed every single word, but so sometimes imaginations fail us, or what seems good in a conference room may not be in applicability.
That happens
All
to
right.
us all.
Yeah. All right, so if you don't have any further questions on that, we can, and I assume you don't have any questions about the new definition section. Okay. So that we can go on to the tariffs, if that's okay. Is that, Ms. Chappell, you have
Yes.
questions about that?
I don't actually have questions. I just was here to listen
Okay.
to your comments and take notes and.
Okay, I think that we can probably go through and explain our changes and why we came about that, and then you can follow up with any questions that you have.
Thank you.
So, the first,
Oh, by the way, let me introduce staff.
sorry.
I apologize. In the light suit here is Daniel Hinton. He works primarily, almost exclusively with tariffs in our financial analysis division. In the middle is Ben Bellamy. He is a staff attorney here, and he's really the main attorney behind all these regulations. I get the glory, he gets the work. And then we have Mary Whitaker, who works in our financial analysis division. And then we have Jeff Klein in the red shirt back there in our filings division. And combined, they're the ones that have overseen a lot of this process. And so more specific questions they might be able to answer, not us. So anyway, I apologize for that interlude. Back to it, Ben.
Okay, the first part is just, we're creating a primary definition section that he kind of alluded to, which will have definitions. Any definition that's applicable to all of 807 Chapter 5 will be basically in the very first section of the regulation. And KRS Chapter 13A, if you want to have a main definition section, you have to put it as the very first one. And so what we did is anything, when we were going through, we noticed there was a lot of definitions that were repeated like 5 or 6 times throughout. In order to cut down on that at the beginning, we were making a definition section, putting all of those type of terms in the main section, and then any term that's specific to a particular regulation, we were keeping it in the particular regulation. So with respect to the tariffs, that's what these deletions are here in the definition section. It's just definitions that were moved to the primary definition section. That will be the new 001. So there wasn't, although those are all deleted, there's no actual substantive change there. They would all still apply. And those are just definitions that were repeated like 6 or 7 times throughout the regulation. So then the next change, I apologize. So this is the actual filing requirement. It's each tariff sheet supporting document. This is maintained, and we'll come back to it. It's further down in the regulation, and it was in the general section, and there's actually a filing procedure section. So because that provision was specifically addressing how you actually file a tariff in the tariff filing system, we just thought it would be more appropriate to put it in the filing procedure section. So when people go to look and they see that section, they'll be like, oh, well, that's probably where it is. Instead of being in the general section where you have then a bunch of other filing stuff in a separate section. So this is just a minor change that requires when you file the tariff electronically. So Section 3 is the format of the tariff. And this is submit the tariff in a PDF compatible with being viewed in the Adobe Acrobat Reader. And currently there's a requirement in our general procedure section with respect to filings in any case that requires that any filing that's done electronically be done in a PDF format. So this was just added to. And the reason for that is that the PDF format's the easiest one and the most generally compatible that every single person can use and works with our system. So that way the most people will be able to view it. And then these requirements are from, they're similar things so there's the D, the PDF, the searchable. The reason for that is, particularly with longer tariffs, it can be kind of hard for people to find things. And so, you know, if you put it in the searchable format, then people can use Control F and hopefully find what they're looking for, which generally, you know, any Word document can be converted to searchable PDF by just doing save as PDF. So we didn't think that would present much of an issue for people. And then the scan resolution, 300 dots per inch, that's just brought over from the 001. And, you know, a lot of times I don't think you'll actually be scanning. If you did it in a Word, you might be converting. I guess if you're signing it, you might scan it. But basically it's just, we talked about actually, or there was some potential of, you know, changing that 300 dots. I think that's in there according to the tech or IT because it has to do with the size. You want it to be able to actually read it, but if someone does it at too high of a format, even if it's just like a blank black and white page, if you have it at a really high, you know, it might be so big it would be hard for our system to manage. My guess is unless you're filing a really long document that 300 dots, you know, would not really come into play very often. The spreadsheet, so if you're doing just a tariff filing, this is this wouldn't come up very often, but there's some situations where you would do a tariff filing where you wouldn't actually be filing an application for rate adjustment. I think Daniel can correct me, but I think that would generally come up like within some sort of non-recurring charge is the most likely, because that's something you can do through a tariff filing where you wouldn't do an application. But in those circumstances, some of those circumstances, there are filing requirements where you're supposed to basically file the support for the non-recurring charge. You know, the reason we're going to charge this is because it's going to cost X, Y, and Z, you know, to do this, you know, component of the service. And this requirement just is to request that when you're filing that support, that you file a PDF document of it too, or I'm sorry, Excel, because staff in those cases almost immediately when they get the tariff, when they're determining whether or not to suspend it, they need to know how the actual math was, you know, worked out, and they normally will almost immediately request an Excel spreadsheet, and basically to kind of prevent that extra step so they can just look at it and determine, okay, we'll accept this or we need to suspend it and ask more questions, you know, we put this in there so that they would just immediately have the Excel spreadsheet, which is something that's generally always requested, and it kind of takes out that extra step of just, okay, you filed this now, we're immediately going to request you file that Excel. But that's not really intended to add an additional requirement, just if there's a requirement to file some spreadsheet already with whatever filing you're making, that you file it as an Excel also. Oh, Form 2, okay. So, this was something that we changed, and someone did make a comment yesterday, which might prompt a change, I don't know. But basically the form, so when you're filing tariff, you know, the first page would be the tariff Form 1. Every other page would be the tariff Form 2, which is basically a blank page with, you know, the information at the top and the bottom. And the form itself indicates what information needs to be in there. And honestly, for people that are filing a lot of tariffs, they might already know what needs to be in there. But so the idea with this change was just when you incorporate a form into the regulation, it automatically incorporates. The form is considered to be basically part of the regulation. So if you say file tariff Form 2, and the form requests this information, then automatically by requiring that you file a completed version of that form, you're requesting that information be included. So that was kind of the basis of this change, was basically so you don't have, you're listing what's required in the form, but also you already have the form which shows what's required. It just was to kind of take that out so that, for one, so you don't have it in there twice, but also if you ever adjust the form, you don't have to worry about the reg being inconsistent with the form. It's just, which in order to adjust the form, we would have to actually go through a formal regulatory process. You can't just adjust the form. So we would, you know, if we did adjust the form, maybe we'd go through like a regulatory process just like this and say, we're adjusting the form. And at the bottom of this regulation, there's like the date. You know, we're using the tariff Form 2 dated January 2020. You know, and if we got an updated one, it'd be tariff Form 2 dated January 2021. Not that there's any plan to do that, but there was a comment yesterday that it might be somewhat confusing for people that are not regular users.
I think it's fair to say it is confusing.
Yes.
For people who are regular users.
With respect to the page number.
Yeah.
So there was some encouragement. So if you look there, this kind of explained the page number. And there was a suggestion that even if we, you know, do this and say file all subsequent pages on tariff Form 2, that we still explain how you're supposed to number the pages. So I think that is probably, because the form doesn't actually explain that. It says put the page number, so we probably will need to adjust that in some way. But if you have a suggestion of how to do that, you know, we would definitely welcome, you know, that suggestion. But basically, I guess, you know, try to include something maybe within that 4 there that kind of explains how you're supposed to number the pages on the Terraform 2. And, I think some people might think that the current language even is a little confusing, so we might need to, adjust that. But that's obviously something that someone suggested and seemed like a pretty decent idea. So because this section 3 here, or I'm sorry, we're in the overall section 3, and this section title is format, and the main regulation is tariff. So in the old version, there was a lot of little formatting requirements that were kind of spread throughout the regulation. You might have some in the filing section, and so we tried to get those into what we believed would be the more correct section. So you would have one section discussing the actual form of the tariff, and then a separate section discussing how the tariff would be filed. So you wouldn't have a section with the form and then a section discussing how it should be filed that also includes formatting requirements. So that's what this 5 here, this was basically moved from down below. And it is identical except that we added that C there. So that's a new notation to basically indicate that you've moved something from another page. That's the same thing with this. That section 6, it just says a tariff may be divided into sections. That's currently down below, I think in the filing section again. So we just put that in the formatting because we thought it was more of a formatting issue. 7 is new. It is a new formatting requirement, which is if a tariff is longer than 30 pages, it shall include an index identifying the location of each rate, if applicable, and if applicable, each section. With the idea that, and the 30 pages was kind of chosen as, the starting length, but some tariffs obviously get up into the hundreds of pages, and with those, if there's no index, it becomes really difficult for people to find what they're looking for. So I don't know that, the 30 pages was set in stone, but that was kind of what was decided as kind of a reasonable number, but
Owens is 225 pages.
yeah. So I imagine yours would fit into the larger. But yeah, basically, you all might do it already. A lot of utilities already do break it up and put an index. But there are, I guess, a few, that don't, and even with the larger. So that's basically to make it easier for staff to find stuff and make it easier for staff communicating with utilities to refer to things and make it easier for the general public, too, just to define what they're looking for.
Did we discuss yesterday, I can't remember this, is when, because I don't think if this regulation were to go into effect, wouldn't require Owen to immediately file a brand new tariff with an index. I think it'd be up on the, did we discuss maybe?
There was a suggestion and that about when that requirement would go into effect, and that's kind of true, I think, with any of the changes, because some of the changes, like, we obviously would have recognized that there would need to be an implementation period, and it might be a period, or it might be the next time we update our tariff, or it might be the next time we update a contract or something, depending on what the change is. So with respect to those, we didn't necessarily put it in there, in part because we didn't know what would be the appropriate implementation period, and kind of seeking, stakeholder input regarding, what would be the appropriate input. Perhaps on something like this, it would be, when you update your tariff the next time or something.
Right, because Ms. Japp, I'm looking at Owens, and there's new parts, there's old parts, and
Of course.
everything. And it's not a criticism. This is only an observation. I understand
Yes.
it would, setting up a table of contents might be challenging.
We internally have one, so
Okay.
it is something we
Oh,
can
wow,
supply you
okay.
easily and file whenever needed.
If needed. But,
Yes.
they're saying that for utilities that may qualify, they may exceed 30 pages. We weren't thinking the regulation goes into effect and immediately everybody's going to have to amend their tariffs to include the table of contents. That would cause Mr. Hinton to lose the rest of his hair.
And I would,
Sorry.
and that's something like the implementation period is something that we would welcome, like comments and an explanation of why a certain thing would be good. And so if multiple people kind of give different dates, we can kind of look and see what would be the most appropriate. Because it's kind of hard for us to judge, you know. Obviously we can come up with what we think would be best, but without knowing why people think certain things, it might be more difficult. I will say that says index. Some of them do a table of contents, but then, you know, Terraform 1 does say the first sheet of the tariff shall be Terraform 1. So, I mean, I guess then you put the index right after that. I don't know. But just something I noted. I think one reason it says index potentially so it could be at the end or the beginning, I guess. I don't know.
No, once again, these are all starting points for discussion.
Yeah. I think it was left intentionally ambiguous there so that. Okay, the next section is the contents of the schedules. So we separated, or this was already separated from the format, but it's more the information that's going to go into the Terraform 2, the schedules that are containing the rates, basically. So the first section was deleted, and that's because, for one, the statute already requires that you file a schedule containing the rates, but also it's because it says addition to a clear statement of all rates, but the statute requires that all rates be filed. But then the second part of it is basically if you go to what is now subparagraph 1 and will be subparagraph 2 of that section, it basically requires the exact same thing. So we made that 1, so the following information shall be shown in each rate schedule, if applicable, under the following captions. And so if you look there, what was 2A and will now be 1A, it says applicable, show the territory covered. So that's kind of what, you know, we thought 1 was getting at. Each rate schedule shall contain the city, town, village, or district in which the rates are applicable. So we just deleted that, and then it's show territory covered, and then the subparts to 1 we moved down as subparts to that other part. You can see the green. That means it was edited and copied from above. Though as a caveat, I will say that sometimes when we edit and copied things, it would show up as a deletion and then a new insertion. Sometimes it would show up as a green. I don't know. Something the way that how Word works. So we deleted that, and if it is subject to a late payment charge, and so basically we deleted that because we thought it was covered in E, which is the very next one. And obviously, with respect to any charge, you'd have to put the conditions under which, you know, it would be charged. So we felt like that would cover, you know, whether or not you're charged for late payment if you don't pay the minimum payment, or if you don't pay the minimum payment in the volumetric charge. D may have been distinguishing between them, you know, the customer charge and the volumetric. I don't know, but basically we thought that was covered with E, though. So if you scroll down to section 5, or that, just scroll up a tab, a little bit more. I was gonna, that subsection, or that subparagraph 5 was moved above, basically. That was what I was looking at earlier. So there at subparagraph, or you can scroll back to start at 5. So that first part was deleted because it says, and conform to the requirements established in this subsection. Basically, we just thought that was superfluous language because you're automatically required to comply with the regulation, so there's no really need to state that. And I'm sorry, yeah, so the 300 dot per inch stuff actually was moved from down here. I'm sorry. The PDF was added above that I was talking about, but the 300 dot stuff is already applicable. So then now here is where we added, if you look at 2 there, that's the basically the filing requirement that was above in the general section. So it's now in section 5, which is the filing requirement section. And that is an error there, but we added that except as provided in 801 KR 5001 section 14. And this may require us to go to section, or 00. Basically that's obviously supposed to be 807. That's just a typo. But basically that's referring to the general application for general, or the requirements for filing an application for a general rate adjustment section. And we basically added language in there which we can pull up if you're interested, but when people file an application for a general rate adjustment currently, they file the application pursuant to 001 section 16, and section 16 is renumbered as section 14, so that's what that's referring to. It's referring to the renumbered version of it. And when they file the application, they'll file the revised tariffs with the application, and obviously the application and all the other supporting documents. But they don't, no one generally files the tariff also with the tariff filing system at the exact same time, because generally people consider filing the application to be the filing of the tariff. And so to recognize that, we put something in that section that basically says the filing of the tariff pursuant, as required in this section, because it says you have to file the tariff with the application. So it shall be in lieu of filing the tariff through the tariff filing system in 011. And so then this recognizes that exception and says, except as provided in this section where you're filing it as part of the general application, each tariff shall be filed through the tariff filing system. And potentially we were going to add, anytime you're filing a tariff as part of an application for a rate adjustment, like if you're filing an alternative rate filing case, or anytime you would file, there's certain procedures under which you could request a rate adjustment in which you would file some sort of application as opposed to just filing a tariff. And essentially, I think the idea is to include language in those that says, when you're filing a tariff, that's you filing a tariff. You don't have to file it again as part of the tariff filing system. And then those would be added in here too as the exceptions. Meaning you're always filing a tariff as part of the application when an application is required, and that's the filing of the tariff. But when filing it through this tariff filing system would be under the circumstances where you're just filing a tariff without having to file an application. And that's basically what's already done in practice by pretty much everybody, but it's sort of just recognizing that in the regulation that that's what's occurring and what's been accepted. So this document was changed to tariff filing on that subparagraph 3, which tariff filing is the schedule containing it's the tariff and any supporting documents is basically the definition of tariff filing. So they'll be deemed submitted pursuant to subsection 2, and that explains when they would be deemed submitted. And that's another reason why that filing requirement was moved down here, because when they're deemed filed was already in this section, so it made sense to have it directly above and then. So, section 6, those things there were just deleted and moved up, like we talked about earlier. So this is a change, like the notice for a tariff. Their 001 contains notice requirements for the filing of a general rate application. And they're really specific, as I'm sure you all know. That notice requirement, basically, the notice requirement in 001 is the exact same notice requirement in 011. So in 001, when you file a general rate application, it would say file or give notice to customers pursuant to section 17 in 001. We deleted section 17 completely out of 001 and now just simply say give notice pursuant to the notice requirement in 011, which is the exact same notice requirement, but it was basically in there twice. And so we deleted out of 001 and basically just referred to the notice requirement in 011. Except that this one in 011 always referred to tariff filing and the other one referred to application. So we added application here to reflect that change. And there was another substantive change here regarding the notice on the website, in that we added it should be published on the website in a prominent manner. And that's to address issues where people might have multiple pages and they might post a notice on some random page, but it's not linked from anywhere where anyone would actually see it. So we want it to be prominent. And whether or not in a prominent manner is the most appropriate way to express that, feel free to comment on that. But the idea is that we want people to see the notice. Yeah. These are all just changes to reflect the application. There was an addition that said if notice is mailed to its customers, basically if you look in subparagraph 4, the proof of notice, you would normally file something like proof of notice, and a lot of utilities I think will file the actual notice itself, but we just put in there, file a copy of the notice itself along with the proof of notice. So the proposed effective date and the date of the proposed effective date. So that's supposed to be the proposed effective date of the rate and the date the tarifying or application is expected to be filed, which I think you're currently required to do. Like when you file the general rate application, you would file, if you give notice before the application, you would give notice of the effective date of the rate and notice of when you're expected to file. That may need to be cleaned up with respect to the effective date, but that's the intent there. And proposed rates was changed because the date the proposed rates are expected to be filed with the commission, because it was changed to tariff filing and application are expected to be filed with the commission. But proposed rate may need to be reflected there in A, actually. But that's the intent of that, to say in the notice, give the proposed effective date and the date you expect to actually file the application of tariff. This notice at C was changed. So it's, if you look at C, what used to be C and D, the amount of the change requested in both dollar amounts and percentage change for each customer classification to which the proposed rates will apply. And then D was the amount of the average usage and the effect upon the average bill for each customer classification to which the proposed rates will apply. That was changed because most utilities, the C potentially, could have been interpreted to basically be saying, the proposed change for each customer class. But because those are two separate things, they must mean two different things. And so generally I think the way it's been interpreted is that C requires you to provide the total dollar amount and percentage change for each customer class in total, like the revenue requirement. So we're going to get $1 million in revenue from residential and $1 million from industrial and $500,000 from commercial and go through each customer class. And then you would show what you were getting previously and with the changed rates what you're getting, and then the percentage change. Whereas what used to be D and now would be C, you're actually giving the average usage of each customer class, and how, based on that usage, how the average bill would be affected by the proposed rate. And the idea was that the providing the total revenue requirement change in a public notice, for residential customers, they're probably not really going to know what that means per se. And it might be somewhat confusing if they're getting the average change in the bills and then they're getting the average change in the revenue requirement. Then they've got two numbers. Whereas the industrial and commercial customers who might be more sophisticated, if they wanted that information, they would probably be able to find it by looking at the application itself. And so that's why that was removed. And that, except for local exchange companies, wouldn't really apply to you all, but that's in the 001 right now, and basically says that local exchange companies, which are telephone, don't have to provide that in their notice. So, which most of them don't have regulated rates anyway. So. This abbreviated form of notice was basically pulled from 001. It was in 001, but it was not in this. I think there is actually a change in the language a little bit, because there was unfortunately when we pulled it over here, that change is not actually indicated because we copied it after the deletion, so it's not actually showing. But I think in 001, the abbreviated notice refers to a coupon. And it's basically like you would cut out the coupon from the notice and then you'd bring it in and you'd get a copy of like things, and that was somewhat antiquated, and so we just deleted the coupon and basically indicated how you would, obtain the information in the, which I don't think that's used very often, but. This change was basically intended to reflect the fact that there are some utilities. We made a change in 06 specifically for sewage utilities that may have revenue of less than $250,000, that they do not have to have a public office or any office open to the public, because a lot of those utilities are run out of someone's house in a neighborhood, and they serve like just the people in those neighborhoods, and so it was somewhat burdensome for them to have an office in And that's basically reflecting that there are those utilities that may not have an office. So. There are sewage utilities that are serving like a couple hundred customers. So this is the deal with special contracts. Currently, the special contracts, some people file special contracts through an application. Some people file them in tariff filings, and then the commission will either not or will suspend them and open up a case to actually address the special contract. And so this change here was basically added in the first part to essentially indicate that special contracts should be filed through the tariff filing system. And then the second part is somewhat minor, but basically for all future special contracts, and obviously that date, as the implementation of these regs, you know, that date would be pushed back clearly. That was just a placeholder date. But for any contracts, special contracts that are formed after these regulations go into effect, that they would have the first page would have a space at the bottom, basically, where the commission puts its stamp, so that the stamp could be seen and wouldn't obscure any language in the contract. Particularly because, like, once the contracts get older and, like, the scan quality kind of goes down, it can sometimes be hard to read what's being said. I think right now we put a stamp on every single page. So that's basically it. The language for deviations is changed because LRC, when we updated the gas regulations, LRC has certain language requirements, and a lot of them come directly from KRS Chapter 13A. But with respect to deviations, they require us to put a more specific standard in there that kind of has like factors that we'll look at. And so they proposed language when we did the gas, and that language was included in the main regulation, the 001. And then what we're trying to do is just say in the deviation section, you can request a deviation from this regulation, and then put that you can request it pursuant to the procedures in 001. Potentially, LRC will require us to put that deviation language, but basically it'd be similar to the language in 001. So it's not clear whether or not they'll allow us to refer back to 001. But that's it. I didn't know if you all had any questions about that.
No, thank you.
We'll move on to poll attachments. Do you all need to take a break or just plow on through? Get us out of here in time for reasonable time to lunch. And Ben, do you want to give a little background to the genesis of from where a lot of this language came?
Yeah. So obviously, like, we have the current pole attachment regulation in 06, which effectively just says that cable television providers are entitled to attach to poles, and the commission, and you have to file a tariff governing the terms and conditions of pole attachment. And there's a case from like the 80s that kind of goes through and actually sets forth a lot of like requirements with respect to what can be in the pole attachment contracts and things like that, and the amounts of money and stuff that can be charged. But basically, as you all probably know, there's a federal statute that essentially says that if the federal government, or that allows the FCC to regulate pole attachments, unless the states are regulating it, in which case the states' regulations will trump the federal regulations. So that's why the commission did that in the 80s. And the way the commission did it is, which was affirmed by the Court of Appeals, was that an attachment was actually a service and a rate that was regulated by the commission. And there was a comment yesterday regarding the fact that the federal statute actually doesn't. So if the commission weren't regulating pole attachments, then with respect to all of the investor-owned utilities, they would fall under the FCC regulations, which they've been, you know, expanding their regulations pretty significantly and pushing really hard for broadband expansion.
I think instead of CATV, it's all communication. They've expanded it so that, you know, it encompasses, you know, broadband, information services.
Yeah, that's what, and the statute too indicates that.
The federal statute.
Yeah, the federal statute indicates that it expanded it to telecommunications providers. You know, the commission since then, through orders and some, you know, staff opinions, has indicated that ours, like, similarly extended, and particularly, you know, I think where it's becoming an issue recently is with respect to small cell cellular, who are starting to request attachments. And perhaps they're doing it just as like feelers right now, but for when they want to start implementing 5G, they're going to be putting them every several hundred yards, I suppose. I don't know much about it, but that's just what I've read. And so, you know, the idea of this was to expand it similarly to the federal, in part so it's the federal statute, where ours is fully preempting the federals, even though, you know, we've interpreted that it is, but and there was some discussion yesterday about, you know, that the federal doesn't apply to, it would apply to investor-owned, but, you know, it wouldn't apply to municipals and co-ops. But the commission's previous regulation indicated that, you know, as a rate and service, and you know, has regulated pole attachments and has historically done it through cases, which hasn't really been much of an issue because there's generally one cable provider, I think, and, you know, so everyone was kind of getting along with joint use agreements or, you know, just special contracts. But I know there's been kind of an uptick in questions. I know there's a lot of issues with the Kentucky Wire getting attachments, and which caused a lot of delays for them. And then we've had, you know, one major complaint case for a fiber optic build out in Lexington and pole attachments that took a little bit of time to resolve, and kind of anticipating, and the FCC has kind of encouraged all the states to look at their regs and start thinking about updating them with respect to the broadband and 5G build out, and
they kind of have a model regulation, which
and they have some suggestions and model regulations and things, but basically what this regulation is in large part it's taken from the federal regulation, except that and the regulation that it's primarily taken from is 47 CFR section 1.1411. And there's some related regulations before and after that regulation from which other parts come from, because there's like a definition section to that regulation, and some of that was incorporated into this. So that was kind of the starting point of, you know, taking portions of that. And if you look at that reg, in this pole attachment regulation, they're at section, what is section 4 of our regulation? That's the one that corresponds to 47 CFR section 1.1411. And that's basically the procedure for new attachments. And some of the stuff above corresponds to some preceding regulations. And then some of the stuff below section 4 of our regulation corresponds to some federal regulations that come after that. But it is not a direct copy. But if you look at the federal regulation, you look at section 4 of our regulation, like you could track them together and they will roughly align. Except that we took out some things that were more favorable to pole attachers in the FCC reg, and we took some of that stuff out of ours. And one example is application, because the process as envisioned by the federal government is you would file an application for attachments based on the number of poles you're requesting to attach to. You would have a certain amount of time to review the application. You would first have a certain amount of time to review it for completeness. So they basically don't want you waiting and then you'd have a certain amount of time to review it for substance. So for substance, it's basically 45 days. And then it's 10 days for completeness, but the 10 days is encompassed in that 45 days. And under the federal, I think the idea of the completeness versus the substance is they don't want someone they're trying to avoid people intentionally delaying the implementation just because they don't want to deal with it. And I think in part they're concerned about, because some utilities are actually going to be competitors of the entities that are trying to attach, particularly some of the telephone utilities and stuff, because they're both offering broadband services. But the reviewing for completeness, they don't want someone, waiting till the 45 days and then being like, oh, the application wasn't complete, sorry, start over. So they said you have 10 days to tell someone whether it's complete or not, and then 45 days to review for substance. But under the federal rule, if you don't say that the application is incomplete within 10 days, then it's deemed to be complete, which we deleted that. Because, for one, if, like, on the 11th day, you just haven't told someone it's complete, and, if they just failed to actually identify the polls that are, if they left something out that makes it impossible for you to actually figure out what the heck they're talking about, then if it's deemed complete, then, how can you be expected to actually complete the survey within 45 days? With the idea that, if you're constantly missing the 10 days, or, if you're missing it by a day, it's one thing, but if you're constantly missing it all the time, then it becomes an issue of, are you willfully violating the commission's regulations? As opposed to just deeming it complete, and then, if it's not actually complete and it's deemed complete, how are you all actually supposed to review it? So that's just one example of a change that was made, making this less favorable to attachers. And you can kind of go through, but that's a general idea. You have 45 days to do the survey work, and more for larger orders. And then you have a certain amount of time to do the make ready. And then if you don't do the make ready within a certain amount of time, then they can exercise, the attacher can exercise self-help. And the self-help is governed in basically the last section. And it's basically through retaining contractors from a list of approved contractors that the utility would be required to maintain. And there is procedures for requesting that new contractors be added to the list. And it's different for what they consider to be simple and complex work. And they use two different terms. They use work in the communication space and work above the communication space. And then alternatively, they use simple and complex. The simple and complex comes into play with the one-touch make ready. And the one-touch make ready was kind of tacked on to the existing reg, which used the communications versus the non-communication space. But basically, for work that's done in the complex arena outside the communication space, or even in the communication space, if it's going to be something that's likely to lead to an outage or something, then the control you have over the contractors that would be used is greater. Whereas if it's work that's just in the communication space and it's not likely to cause an outage for anybody else, then the control you have over the contractors is less. And that's from the federal regulation. But the idea, because our previous regulation was so bare bones, the idea of using the federal regulation was more of like a starting point. So it has the original, what the federal regulation was recently updated. They used to just have the timeline, like the 45 days for survey, the time for make ready work, and then the time for self-help, and that's where their regulation ended. And then they recently added the one-touch make ready. So our reg has both of those in there. Kind of with the idea of getting input from all the different stakeholders on, for one thing, the timelines. We left the timelines as they are in the federal regulation, but are the timelines appropriate? Does there need to be more? Because there is some tiering based on poll numbers. But, does there need to be more tiering?
So,
You know, is the one-touch make ready appropriate in all circumstances, or, does that need to be? But this was kind of like a starting point, because without having a starting point, we wouldn't have really, we've been kind of talking, not necessarily about anything. But that's kind of the idea behind it. And
I'm sorry,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
want to ask a question of Owens. Do you have a lot of issues with third-party attachers or broadband rollout? I mean, did KCNA, Kentucky Wired, come through Owens territory?
we didn't have a lot of issues, I mean, did we?
No,
I don't-
they pretty much came with everything kind of ready for us,
Mhm.
worked really well with our engineers and.
I heard that they enjoyed working with the co-ops. It was the municipals that they really had.
Is that right?
Well,
we didn't
because
have
the
any.
municipals aren't subject to our jurisdiction, and they kind of may have had pretty high rates compared to whatever might be in. But do you have any other issues, outstanding issues with third-party attachers right now?
Not really. We have pretty good relationships with all of ours, and if we have any issues, we have good communication, we can kind of work through it, so, not really.
Okay, I was just wondering, because I know that in some areas, and maybe in the more northern part of the territory where you have a little denser, more urban service territories, you might start seeing some of the microcells, some of the wireless carriers reaching out to attach to the tops of poles and the like of that. Have you seen the little microcells that go on about? And
We have a hard time with that.
That's-
I mean, anything that's above
Mhm.
that dangerous zone, we don't want it at the top,
I understand that. But,
Don't mind for them to be on the pole, but we
Mhm.
do not want them above that dangerous zone
I'd
that
imagine that'd
only
be-
we control,
right, and I think that that's something that we'll work through.
Yeah, I know Chris Perry yesterday, that was, I think when he mentioned safety, that's probably, I know all the conferences we go to for joint use, of course, this is a big issue. And
Right.
our big issue is we want our guys that are trained to do the work in that zone to be there and no one else in that zone.
Well, you mean when you say in the zone to do the work?
Where our primary is, where
Okay.
that,
Mm-hmm.
someone could die.
No, I understood.
I mean, to put it in simple terms, we're just very concerned about anyone being above that space, because even on poles that we have joint use with, that they own, we own that primary, right? I mean, we're in that space, that's what I meant. They're
Mhm.
below us. even
Right,
on
so
their
like we
pole.
have joint use with one of the telephone companies. Is that-
Exactly.
And I think that I haven't looked at it for a while, but LG&E finally had to come to terms with how those microcells, and they amended their tariff in 2016, but was recently changed in the most recent rate case to address that. And I don't know the exact terms. I don't know, Ben, if you're familiar with how
Yeah, and
LG&E addressed that.
not off the top of my head, I mean, I definitely looked at it. And
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, you're fine. No. And that's one of the, I guess, places for comment too. So, we did this. This comes directly from the federal regulation, or effectively. I mean, I might have been edited a little, but basically, it says you have to provide non-discriminatory access. But, notwithstanding that, a utility may deny access to any pole duct on a non-discriminatory basis where there's insufficient capacity or for reasons of safety, reliability, and generally applicable engineering purposes. And then this deals with easements, basically saying, or I'm sorry, the one I'm highlighting on my computer, which is not on the screen. So, so that is an exception dealing with easements, saying that you're not responsible for getting easements for them, even though they're attaching to your poles. But if up in the definitions, there was a question yesterday about transmission lines, and really the regulation doesn't really distinguish between distribution and transmission, except to the extent that, the safety issue. And there are other states, I think, that do have some specific things with respect to transmission, like, that effectively, like, this won't apply to transmission lines, which potentially may be something that you know, people would think would be appropriate, but whether or not, you know, what you would define as transmission might be an issue. But, and then another, I think, you know, point of comment, because this regulation in the definition section explicitly excludes attachments for macro cell facilities. And if you scroll up, yeah, so it first defines macro cell facilities, and this language is in part comes from LG&E's current tariff, which does kind of address the macro cell and micro cell issues, because they do have micro cell attachments that are above the
They're at
electrical
the top of
space.
the pole. I mean, it's deemed usable space, but to your question, I'm just want to start interrupting, but if you have a list of approved contractors, you know, that could alleviate the concern about who would be, you know, working above it. But that's we'll work. You know, we'll try to
Of course,
hammer it all.
that's for us though. I mean,
But if it's like the one touch aircraft, you know, what happens if somebody goes on a bike, but then they can be trained. But then it's what you're talking about.
we'll add some.
Well, no, I
comments for you.
understand, and this is, like I said, this is merely a starting point, realizing, and this is probably the first regulation we've come up with out of whole cloth in a long time, and because it represents a significant change in, well, codification in the way that pole attachments are addressed has been said. We've done it upon complaint. We've issued a bunch of opinion letters, but there's nothing out there. You'd have to look in several different spots to see how the commission has addressed pole attachments. And so this is an opportunity to get it all in one spot and hopefully strike the right balance between protecting your facilities, making sure that you're not providing service for free to the pole attachers, but also not being an impediment to, you know, broadband rollout or like. Let me ask you, unrelated to any of that, is Owen County interested in the FCC auction? Or I think that there is a cooperative out in western Kentucky that might be looking into rolling out broadband, but I'm not sure. Has Owen County ever looked into?
I don't know where we stand on that. I mean, I know that's.
It's always out there.
It's been talked
Right.
about, of course, but where we are actively, I would not be able to.
Okay, I just
Even
didn't know. I'm not
comment
trying to
about
put you
that.
on the spot on that.
Right.
It was just curiosity on my spot.
Yeah.
Just because that would also affect,
Sure.
you know, use of the communication space if you have your own there. And what about SCADA? How do you all have, you know, I know like some of the cooperatives will have, you know, wireless antenna towers or,
And we do have that, yes.
okay, and
We have scale.
I know that there's the, is it on the 6G? Or the
I don't know.
Okay,
Do
sorry.
you? Yeah.
The only reason is that I know that there's some action at the FCC that could affect, they might open up that spectrum that's typically used for communication for utilities and other things. The FCC is contemplating opening up that spectrum, and there might be interference with the existing things, at which
Gotcha.
point a lot of the utilities will have to string their own fiber just to have the information, so.
We have had to do some of that.
Okay.
Put our own fiber for our
Right.
antennas and so forth there for the SCADA system. I do know that, but I would not be able to talk intelligently about it.
I've said everything I know about it. I don't know anything else. So I'll stop there where I sound semi-coherent on that matter. Okay, I'm sorry. Ben, I apologize to interrupt you. If you can get your train of thought back, I congratulate you.
I don't remember what I was talking about, but I mean, basically, my point was that, you know, in the definition of new attacher, we basically excluded people with applicable joint use agreements, with the idea that those people are not maybe similarly situated with other attachers, because in some ways you're trading the use of your poles. And then, and people trying to attach macro cell facilities. So new attachers is the definition of the person who would be entitled to use the expedited procedures down below. And with respect to all the days and stuff like that. And that's not to say that macro cells couldn't be attached, but if they were attached, you know, the utility would, one, have to, you know, because this is saying that it has to be consistent with this, but if, you know, a utility was having someone else, you know, they wanted to create a rate for someone else to attach, because there are some utilities that have allowed macro cells to be attached to their transmission poles. They do that, I think, through special contracts, but that's kind of the idea that those one-off type of things wouldn't be, you know, through these attachment regs, and so that's why the macro cell was excluded. You know, it can be done through a special contract, you know, if that's appropriate. But the, you know, whether or not there should be other attachments that would be similar to that macro cell, you know, what, and kind of what should be and what shouldn't be subject to these expedited procedures would be stuff that, you know, would probably be helpful to the commission to review. But I do know that the 5G is probably going to start coming up more and more with respect to attachments. And did you all have any other questions about anything in the reg, or you know, want me to address anything specifically?
I think we plan to get together as a group at Owen.
Yeah.
And submit some comments for you guys. We kind of wanted to do that as a group. Again, mine is always safety. You know, it's just, you work in this industry and you know how dangerous it is, and you want to make sure everyone is safe and everyone is trained to do exactly their particular job. So with what you have in here, I think that's covered anyway.
Okay. Do you have any other questions, or do you have any other comments on this?
No, but the only thing for the meetings next week.
We'll cover the same ground as what we've covered.
So, okay, so it's another opportunity to kind of hit whatever's
Right.
topic, okay.
As this is, we just realizing that some people couldn't make it to today or yesterday, so
Okay.
next week we'll
Okay.
start all over again. You know, and you all have made it very easy by wanting to discuss, you know, very specific things. I do appreciate that. So would you anticipate coming back?
Yes.
Okay.
I was planning to, so we'll get together and kind of come up with some questions or recommendations and then come back and kind of build on that.
Understood. And we've established yesterday, I think we agreed on April 17th as a deadline by which to file written comments. So there's plenty of time to do so, recognizing that when the legislature's in session, a lot of people are busy. A lot of the policy people for the utilities are busy. Mr. Perry's busy, as well as a lot of people for the investor-owned utilities as well. So we've yet to hear from some of the, I think we had a representative from LG&E here yesterday and some of the cooperatives, but didn't see Kentucky Power or anybody from out in Western Kentucky here. I'm sure they all have an interest in this as well, so.
I would say that LG, like, obviously we didn't like take, you know, we were kind of going from the federal regulation, but, and I'm sure, my guess is that LG&E and KU might make suggestions based on what's currently in their tariff, but they do have some additional stuff with respect to how micro cell facilities should be handled in their tariff that, you know, other utilities might look at. But there is some stuff about, you know, some additional specific safety things that's like, I can't remember them offhand, unfortunately, but you know.
You could always just take a glance at it on our website. They'd have it in there. Well, I do want to say one of the issues we discussed a little bit yesterday is just easements, whether or not your underlying easement would allow for the installation of an antenna on it or a third-party attacher. Some of the old easements for the cooperatives may not allow for anything but an electric line. And it's not your all's obligation to seek an expanded easement on behalf of the attacher. They have to go and negotiate that. So.
And to expand on that point too, because I was tried to ask a question yesterday, but I kind of tripped over myself a little bit. But because with the small cells, some of them, like the large cells, have their own power source oftentimes, but the small cells, they're becoming a customer of the utility, you know, attaching to the top of the pole, and sometimes they're putting a, you know,
there's a meter box.
There's a meter, basically hammering like a little piece of wood into the ground at the bottom and then drilling a meter into it just directly next to the utility pole. And with respect to the easement, we'd written easement language to cover a situation that's covered by some court cases with respect to the FCC that says, you know, they are required to attach and go through the attachment process, but if the easement doesn't, if the utility existing easement doesn't allow for the attachment, the other party would have to go get the easement from the underlying property owner. I did have a slight question with respect to the language that we even included, whether or not it would be broad enough to encompass, or people's thoughts on, you know, if it's broad enough to encompass the additional easement that would be necessary to put that meter down on the ground. Because technically the meter would be utilities property. And, you know, but, you know, that was just one thought. And then the other thing was that, Jeff mentioned the meters, but in part too, the regulation and maybe bringing it to light is in, you know, in some way acts to protect the utilities depending on what's ultimately decided. Because some utilities with the pole attachments have, you know, tariffs that just set like the rate. And that hasn't really been an issue, but, you know, there is some concern because this allows the utilities to recover any of the survey and make ready costs and to make the attachers pay it before they even proceed with the, or provide some sort of security. You know, and there's some, if the current tariff is just, you know, this is the attachment rate of, you know, and it's $5 or $7 per pole, you know, if someone came and was like, well, we want to make, you know, 3,000 attachments, you know, and the make ready cost isn't in there, you know, would you be able to collect that from them? So. If y'all have anything else.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your input. We look forward to seeing you back.
Thank you so much.
We'll be on first name basis, won't we?
Yes, ma'am. All righty. Thank you. This has been very productive for us. I appreciate it. It's the exact reason why we have these meetings.